Academy Award nominee for Best Original Screenplay, September 5, is now on digital. Based on true events at the 1972 Olympics and the hostage crisis that changed media coverage forever. Starring Peter Sarsgaard, John Magaro, Ben Chaplin, and Leonie Benish. Buy or rent September 5 on Fandango at Home now. Rated PG from Paramount Pictures. A quick shout out to the wonderful listeners who threw a few bucks my way recently using the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show's notes, including Frank Martinez, Dwayne Bearfield, Craig Brown, Kathy, and Mike McMains, who is the man behind Tours with Mike, who has been a guest on this podcast a few times. Thanks all. It means a lot to me. Over-the-top campaign rallies? Check. Anti-Semitic and xenophobic slurs? Check. Fights with members of the press who he felt were not supportive of him? Check. Unwillingness to condemn the harmful actions of foreign leaders? Yep. The through line throughout the decades among politicians of the past and present day is often, dare I say, bonkers. He was called Chicago's cowboy statesman, the builder, Kaiser Bill, a dangerous demagogue, and most notably, Big Bill. This is the story of William Hale, Big Bill Thompson, who served as Chicago mayor for 3 terms and was the last Republican, as of this writing, to hold the office of mayor of Chicago. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. Did a version of today's episode way back in 2020, which seems like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? This is a revised, expanded, and re-recorded version of that original episode. If you didn't hear the original, this is all new to you. And if you have listened to the original, I'm hopeful this updated one will have fresh appeal. Born May 14, 1869 in Boston to a well-off family, William Hale Thompson moved to Chicago when he was just 9 days old. At the age of 14, he left home and traveled west, working as an assistant cook at a ranch, and within 5 years he worked his way up to operating feeder ranches in Wyoming and one in western Nebraska that had been purchased by Thompson's father. When his father died, Thompson returned to Chicago in 1890 to manage his family's interests. In 1901, Thompson married Mary Maisie Walker Wise, a secretary who worked in his father's office. He was also elected alderman of the 2nd Ward that same year. The following year, Thompson was elected county commissioner, serving 2 years. He then left public office, and over the next 12 years was a member and sponsor of the Republican Club of Illinois, becoming the club's treasurer in March of 1914. After deciding to try once again at a career in politics, Thompson ran for mayor of Chicago in the 1915 election, but was opposed by both the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Daily News. The Chicago Journal, however, was a huge supporter. This was back when big city newspapers weren't afraid to voice their opinions about political candidates. Thompson lashed out at those newspaper editors who were not supportive of him, mainly Victor F. Lawson, owner-publisher of the Chicago Daily News, and Colonel Robert R. McCormick, who ran the Tribune. Thompson said Lawson and McCormick were, quote, lying, crooked, thieving, rotten newspaper editors, end quote, and that they were the, quote, great cancer gnawing at the very heart of our city of Chicago, end quote. Thompson aggressively went after the publisher of the Daily News, Victor F. Lawson, claiming Lawson's mansion on Lakeshore Drive, reportedly worth nearly $1 million, about $31.2 million in today's money, was taxed a measly $17.32, while more modest homes routinely paid more than $100 in taxes. Lawson's team said the small tax was the result of an error the previous year, during which they overpaid. Thompson jumped on this as well because the county clerk at the time, Robert Schweitzer, was the Democratic nominee for mayor. Thompson reasoned that if Schweitzer made these mistakes as county clerk, how could he be effective as Chicago's mayor? One of Thompson's nicknames, Big Bill, was not just because of his more than 6-foot height and roughly 300-pound frame. It was also for his flamboyant antics. In his book City of Scoundrels, The 12 Days of Disaster That Gave Birth to Modern Chicago, Gary Krist writes that on Election Day, Thompson's team hired extras from a circus to march through the city streets. 3 elephants, a donkey, and a bull moose, symbolizing Thompson's hoped-for appeal to Republicans, Democrats, and progressives, were part of the procession. Thompson won by 147,477 votes, the largest margin of any mayoral candidate in Chicago history up until that time, to become the 41st mayor of Chicago. It should be noted this was the first mayoral election to take place in Chicago after Illinois granted women's suffrage, and 63% of the women now allowed to vote cast their ballots for Thompson. One voter, according to the official report, was the oldest voter to cast a ballot. Mrs. Mary M. Conrad, 102 years old, cast her vote for Thompson at the polling place at 6327 Cottage Grove Avenue, saying, quote, "It's a vote for Thompson, sir, from a daughter whose father and grandfather fought under Washington. I hope it won't be my last. I'm for good government always, and this is my first opportunity to express myself." As the war in Europe became more prominent in newspapers, many Chicagoans felt America should join the Allied forces. The press often denounced those not in favor of war, accusing them of being sympathetic to the German cause. Thompson spoke openly for neutrality, and even after America entered World War I, stated, quote, "I am unalterably opposed to a draft for the purpose of forcing our young men into the trenches of Europe." His views earned him the nickname Kaiser Bill, and citizens demanded he step down. Some even mailed $10 checks in to fund his deportation to Germany. As it often happens in politics, Thompson weathered this storm, although this bad press and animosity from many voters would later hurt his Senate run in 1918. 4 months after he was elected mayor in April of 1915, Thompson closed saloons on Sundays, bowing to pressure from a delegation of local ministers. After confirming this decision with the city council, Thompson quickly boarded a train for Los Angeles and then to Santa Barbara to visit his brother and to avoid the impending backlash. The brewery and liquor interests formed organizations to push back. Their reasoning was Sunday was the working man's day of rest, and if those men wanted a beer or two, he was entitled to do so. Thompson's closings did little to curb drinking on Sundays, as it was a rule that restaurants could remain open on Sundays and sell beer and booze. Nearly every bar owner in the city rushed to City Hall to get a restaurant license. These bars turned restaurants bought a large supply of opaque cups in which they could serve drinks. Many served actual sandwiches at first, but eventually got their hands on sandwich lookalikes made of rubber that they'd put on a plate in front of a drinking customer and pick it up when the guest left, only to be plopped down in front of the next visitor. That is some Chicago ingenuity, I tell you. In July of 1915, while representing Chicago at the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, Thompson received word that the excursion ship, the Eastland, overturned in the Chicago River, resulting in more than 800 deaths. Thompson returned to Chicago by train upon hearing the news, then organized fundraising drives and vowed to punish those responsible for the tragedy. Now, back in 1916, Michigan Avenue ended as a wide street at Randolph and narrowed down to the average width of streets between Randolph and the river. At that point, traffic would swing left about 25 feet, then cross the river on a turntable bridge into Rush Street. One of the projects in the late Daniel Burnham's Plan of Chicago of 1909 was to open Michigan Avenue between Randolph and Chicago Avenue. This would fit nicely into Bill the Builder Thompson's efforts to show Chicago he was a mayor who got things done. This effort was curtailed when America entered World War I and the government took control of all steel production, ruling the bridge would have to wait. Fearing the war might outlast his mayoral term and potentially allow someone else to get credit for it, Thompson claimed Michigan Avenue was a direct route to Fort Sheridan and the Great Lakes Naval Station north of Chicago, and should be considered a military road. If soldiers and sailors needed to be rushed south to Chicago, they would need to use Michigan Avenue. The idea was accepted as legitimate, and the bridge opened on May 1st, 1918, with Thompson cutting the ribbon with gold-plated scissors. He had traffic on the road before the sidewalks had even been put in. In their March 24th, 1919 issue, the Chicago Tribune newspaper announced their support for Maclay Hoyne, who served as Cook County State's Attorney from 1912 to 1920 and was running as an independent in the mayoral election. The Tribune piece referred to Thompson as a, quote, dangerous demagogue and a load of straw thrown into a barn in which a fire has already started. Chicago newspapers do love their fire comparisons. The definition of demagogue, to be clear, is a political leader who seeks support by appealing to the desires and prejudices of ordinary people rather than by using rational argument. The papers accused Thompson of allowing his cronies, quote, to profit from contracts and other graft, and with having allowed the syndicate of gamblers to operate without interference. Instead of responding to these issues, Thompson sidestepped them and focused on presenting himself as the most patriotic candidate, and at campaign rallies entered with a song that began with the lines, "America first, last, and always, our hearts are loyal, our faith is strong." He discussed the League of Nations effort by President Woodrow Wilson, to which Thompson was opposed, saying, quote, "This is a plot by King George to dominate the United States and to regain this vast land lost by King George III at the time of the Revolutionary War. He would do it by casting 5 votes against us every time we cast 1 vote." End quote. Thompson went on to say regarding the King of England, quote, "I'm telling him now, unless he keeps out of our affairs, I'll punch him right in the snoot." At this, he would make a large punching gesture in the air to a roaring fan base. King George V, for those of you who don't follow all things pertaining to the royals, was the grandfather of Queen Elizabeth. Thompson focused his campaigns on national issues rather on local matters, even telling voters during one speech, "As Chicago goes in April, so will the nation in 1920. Do you want Democratic rule and breadlines or Republicanism and prosperity?" Thompson's Democratic challenger, Robert Schweitzer, had the support of Chicago's business elite, who Thompson called, quote, "tax dodgers, possessors of swollen fortunes, and robbers of the working classes." At rallies, Thompson made statements advocating for Irish independence and took shots at the local newspapers, even distributing pages that read, quote, "By voting for Mayor William Thompson, you fight the commercialized newspapers who cheat the school children and you." Thompson went on to win that election with more than 37% of the vote, with Schweitzer coming in at 34.5% and Hoyne with 16%. When later asked about the whole King George thing, Thompson admitted, "I know the Germans and Irish are Democrats, so I had to win them over to get reelected. The Germans were sore at our being pushed into the war, and the Irish were sore at England over its 800 years of rule of their island. Funny thing, though, I understand the king is a pretty nice guy." Thompson's win by slightly more than 3% over his nearest challenger included many votes that came from German and black voters. According to author Douglas Bukowski in his 1998 book, Big Bill Thompson, Chicago, and the Politics of Image, polls showed that Thompson received as much as 78% of the black vote. Newspapers around the country, surprised by Thompson's win, printed headlines such as "Poor Old Chicago," "Un-American Wins," and "Chicago's Shame." The State Journal of Lincoln, Nebraska commented, "A plurality of Chicago voters wanted more of Mayor Thompson, and they have got them. That is their business and their funeral." For all of the support Thompson received from black voters in the April 1919 election, that support was not returned that summer. Post-World War I saw tens of thousands of Southern blacks relocating to Chicago in search of better opportunities during the Great Migration. Settling into neighborhoods near European immigrants on the city's south side, many of the newcomers sought jobs in the stockyards, steel mills, and other industries. Racism, coupled with increased competition for housing and jobs, would soon bring Chicago to its boiling point. On July 27, 1919, near an informally segregated beach near 29th Street, a group of black teens floating on a homemade raft drifted into the White Beach area. One of the white beachgoers began throwing rocks at the teens on the raft, striking 17-year-old Eugene Williams in the head, causing Williams to drown. Although witnesses identified the man who threw the rock, Chicago police refused to make an arrest. Soon violence broke out, resulting in the deaths of 38 people, 23 black and 15 white, and between 1,000 and 2,000 residents lost their homes during a roughly 5-day period of unrest. Sure, Mayor Thompson didn't throw the rock, but it was discovered he refused to request Illinois National Guard troops from Illinois Governor Frank Loudon for 4 days, which many historians believe would have quelled the riot sooner and lessened the loss of life and destruction during the Red Summer of 1919. In 1921, a situation arose between Thompson and Robert C. Crow, the state's attorney, who Thompson helped elect. Crow stated, quote, "I broke with Thompson because he was interfering with my sworn duty to expose and prosecute hellholes of prostitution and commercialized vice." Crow felt Thompson's police force was competing with his office instead of helping it. After his campaign manager was implicated for shaking down school supply vendors for bribes and political contributions, Thompson withdrew from the mayoral race in 1923, and Democrat William Deaver took over as the 42nd mayor of Chicago. During Deaver's term, Wacker Drive was completed, and he sponsored and pushed through legislation to straighten the Chicago River. Not content with staying out of the limelight for 4 whole years, Thompson organized an expedition to locate a tree-climbing fish in the South Seas, covered extensively in the local press. In a sailboat called the Big Bill that was built on the banks of the Chicago River at Riverview Park, Thompson and his party traveled downriver, stopping often at places such as Lockport, Peoria, St. Louis, and others, where the former mayor would eagerly give interviews about his great scientific expedition. That expedition made it as far as New Orleans before things came to a halt. Thompson claimed the crew was superstitious, as he had allowed the ship's captain to bring his wife. The press soon discovered that the expedition began losing crew as early as the Peoria stop, when the cook jumped ship for fear that he would not be paid. Even without a crew, Thompson refused to give up on his quest, claiming, quote, "I made a bet of $22,000 that I would bring back pictures of the tree-climbing fish, and I'm going to do it if I have to go in a rowboat and take the films myself." Thompson instead quietly scurried back to Chicago. 4 years later, Thompson came roaring back, still sporting his 10-gallon Stetson cowboy hat, decrying the open vice, gang violence, and murders that he alleged Mayor Deaver allowed to happen during his term as mayor. His campaign slogan, America First. His gimmick for that election, carrying 2 rats in a bird cage to campaign rallies. The rodents were introduced as Dill and Fred. Dill, short for Dr. John Dill Robertson, who was also running for mayor, and Fred for Fred London, who was a ward boss in Robertson's corner. After 7 long years, Prohibition and the Chicago gang wars were at their zenith. Thompson, realizing Chicagoans wanted their beer, announced he would look the other way on the issue, taking a shot at his predecessor. Quote, "The Deaver administration has made one of the greatest records in Chicago's history for closing up businesses," he said. When I'm elected, we will not only reopen places these people have closed, but will open 10,000 new ones. Al Capone, who had set up operations in Cicero after being driven out of Chicago by Mayor Deaver, was so appreciative of this boost to his bootlegging business, he funneled at least $100,000 into Thompson's campaign fund and even put up a portrait of Big Bill in his headquarters. Thompson won the election with more than 51% of the votes. In an April 27, 1927 Associated Press story I found in the Rock Island Argus titled "Big Bill to Rid Chicago of Gunmen," Thompson, as he prepared to become mayor for a third term on April 18th, was quoted as saying Chicago gangsters, quote, "are going to hit the gravel so fast their shoes will burn up. I'm going to drive all gangsters and crooks out of the city to New York, to Cleveland, to St. Louis and elsewhere, and maybe some will go to London." The article claims Thompson's quote came after he was shown a cablegram from an English newspaper of their account of the election in Chicago that reflected a reign of lawlessness and terror here. Thompson went on to say, quote, "In 90 days, the crooks will be practically driven out of Chicago. The police will be put back into police duties instead of sniffing around for home brew and fanning mattresses for pints." Pointing to an American flag, a picture of George Washington, and to a framed copy of the Declaration of Independence, Thompson said, quote, "This is going to be a city where America is first. See those?" Thompson also smiled when reminded an enthusiastic follower had started a Thompson for President movement. Less than 2 years later, 7 men of the Irish North Side Gang were gunned down in a garage in Lincoln Park by men dressed as Chicago police officers. I have to step back a bit here to mention something that happened that plays into the history of Big Bill Thompson. During the summer of 1926, heavy rains pummeled the Mississippi River's central basin, and by September of that year, the Mississippi's tributaries in Kansas and Iowa were already swollen to capacity. On January 1st, 1927, the river reached flood stage downstate in Cairo, Illinois, the earliest recorded date this had ever occurred. The Mississippi remained at flood stage from Cairo to New Orleans for more than 150 consecutive days. On Good Friday, April 15th, 1927, New Orleans was deluged with 15 inches of rain in 18 hours, making a horrible situation far worse. 6 days later, the levee at Mound's Landing, Mississippi, broke, leading to massive flooding. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, which affected parts of Arkansas, Illinois, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, and Tennessee, left approximately 27,000 square miles underwater, ruining crops, damaging or destroying 137,000 buildings, and caused 700,000 people to be displaced from their homes. 250 lives were lost due to the flooding across the 7 impacted states. So, how does this tie into Big Bill Thompson? Thompson traveled downstate to tour the flooded areas, speaking at public events, championing his own flood control proposals and dismissing those of others, including Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover's, as half-baked. Thompson urged contributions for flood victims, and by the end of May of 1927, Chicago had raised greater than $1 million, more than $18 million adjusted for inflation. In 1931, Big Bill Thompson announced he would run for a 4th mayoral term. Coinciding with his announcement was word that Thompson and his Commissioner of Public Works, Richard W. Wolfe, were being investigated for diverting more than $130,000 raised in the flood relief efforts to their own accounts. Thompson's nemesis, the Chicago Tribune, published evidence suggesting that relief money had been used for political purposes, including images of canceled checks and a bank statement signed by Wolfe. Thompson was also investigated regarding the finances earmarked for the river straightening project. Of course, one with an ego as large as Thompson must have felt untouchable, and he continued with his campaign to be reelected to mayor of Chicago. His primary opponent for this election, Anton Cermak. Big Bill Thompson came out swinging against his opponent, playing to those he thought were his base. At one event, he took a verbal shot at Jewish businessman Julius Rosenwald. Rosenwald, who is a part owner of Sears and Roebuck, also founded the Rosenwald Fund, which, among other philanthropic efforts, donated millions in matching funds to support the education of black children in the rural South. Rosenwald was also the principal founder and backer for the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, to which he gave more than $5 million and served as president from 1927 to 1932. These selfless efforts did not appear to impress Thompson, who during one March 1931 campaign speech said of Rosenwald, "Well, we got a great philanthropist in this town, and he's a Jew, and he's trying to edge his way out of hell by giving part of the money he steals." Anton Cermak campaigned based on a liberal attitude toward the saloon industry, fought the 18th Amendment, which brought about Prohibition, and sought its repeal. As Chicagoans had long since grown tired of Prohibition, which was still in force, Cermak's platform had great appeal. Thompson, in his effort to knock down Cermak, decided to go after Cermak's immigrant background. He was from what was then known as Bohemia, with ethnic attacks. "I won't take a back seat to that bohunk, Chermak, or whatever his name is. Tony, where's your pushcart at? Can you picture a World's Fair mayor with a name like that?" Cermak, who in his youth sold firewood in the city with a horse-drawn cart, was able to respond effectively to these attacks. "He doesn't like my name. It's true, I didn't come over on the Mayflower, but I came over as soon as I could." This response resonated with the large ethnic Chicago population, and Thompson's slurs were largely ignored. Thompson was also known to repeat his past successes over and over at rallies, and sought to weaken Cermak's support of wet rules, as they were known, regarding alcohol consumption. In front of a group of ministers at the Great Northern Theater on Jackson between State and Dearborn, Thompson bragged about how he had closed the saloons on Sundays. When this comment was reported in the general press, it reminded voters of this unpopular decision from all those years before, leading to a swing in support to Cermak, who defeated Thompson by 17 points. Oh, another thing I almost forgot. According to John J. Binder in his 2017 book, Al Capone's Beer Wars, A Complete History of Organized Crime in Chicago During Prohibition, Capone donated $260,000, roughly $5.4 million, adjusted for inflation, to Thompson's failed 1931 campaign. After Thompson's defeat by Anton Cermak, the Tribune did not pull punches, writing on April 9th, 1931, quote, "Thompson recognized the Tribune as his chief enemy. The Tribune was glad to earn that opinion. For Chicago, Thompson has meant filth, corruption, obscenity, idiocy, and bankruptcy. He has given the city an international reputation for moronic buffoonery, barbaric crime, triumphant hoodlumism, unchecked graft, and a dejected citizenship. He nearly ruined the property and completely destroyed the pride of the city. He made Chicago a byword for the collapse of American civilization. In his attempt to continue this, he excelled himself as a liar and defamer of character. He's out. He's not only out, but he is dishonored. He is deserted by his friends. He is permanently marked by the evidences of his character and conduct. His health is impaired by his ways of life, and he leaves office and goes from the city the most discredited man who ever held a place in it." I found numerous newspapers of the day that printed the Tribune's words, not just big national papers, but small papers, including the Selma Irrigator out of Selma, California, which I had to look up. Selma is near Fresno. The Interior Journal of Stanford, Kentucky, and even the Age newspaper from Melbourne, Australia. Mayor Anton Cermak was in office less than 2 years before being fatally shot by a would-be assassin of President-elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt in Miami, Florida, in February of 1933. That story is covered in episode 223 of this podcast. In 1936, Thompson ran for the office of Illinois governor as an independent against Henry Horner. Thompson received only 3% of the vote, and Horner became the first Jewish governor of Illinois. Not one to give up easily, Big Bill Thompson ran in the Republican primary for mayor of Chicago in 1939 and was defeated by a 77 to 23% margin against future Governor Dwight Green. In declining health, Thompson stayed out of the spotlight during his remaining years. After he developed a severe chest cold in February of 1944, doctors placed Thompson in an oxygen tent without success, and he died of a heart attack 7 weeks later on March 19, 1944, at the age of 75, at the Blackstone Hotel, where he had been living for the last few years. He had been estranged from his wife. For such a larger-than-life character, Thompson's funeral was said to be not well attended, with only a few passing by his solid bronze casket, and according to one reporter, there was not, quote, a flower nor a fern to be seen, end quote. He is buried in Oakwood Cemetery on East 67th Street on Chicago's South Side. Oakwood Cemetery is also the final resting place of Italian physicist Enrico Fermi, civil rights activist Ida B. Wells, and Chicago's first black mayor, Harold Washington. Before the end of that month, it was reported a safety deposit box in Thompson's name was found at the American National Bank and Trust, containing $1,466,250. The money and gold certificates were so tightly packed into the container that it, quote, sprang out like jacks in the box when it was opened. According to reports, Thompson's wife Maisie fainted at the sight of the billowing heap of wealth. More deposit boxes were found, rounding the final number closer to $1.8 million, more than $32 million today. Longtime detractors immediately pointed to this hidden stash of wealth as a sign that all his years turning a blind eye to the exploits of organized crime and the likes of Al Capone may have been more profitable than anyone knew. Once word got out about his vast fortune, claims started rolling in, not just from creditors. There was one man in Wisconsin who claimed he once saved Thompson from a potentially fatal nosebleed by pressing a dime under Thompson's nose, and that Thompson promised to provide for the man in his will. A Canadian woman thought she might be the former mayor's foster daughter, and that a $200,000 share of the estate seemed fair. Someone from Louisiana thought Thompson could be a descendant of a relative who disappeared during the Revolutionary War, which would make Thompson kin to the Louisiana claimant. After taxes on the wealth were paid, the rest went to Maisie Thompson, who lived out her days comfortably. Maisie Thompson died in 1958 and was buried near her husband, separated by a tall obelisk bearing the family name. The couple never had children. At the auction of her effects, 2 pieces of note were sold. One was the pen Thompson used when he signed the order to close the saloons on Sundays. The other was the gold-plated scissors Thompson used to cut the ribbon at the opening of the Michigan Avenue Bridge. Thanks for listening to this episode about corrupt Chicago Mayor Big Bill Thompson, Would you like to hear more about other Chicago mayors in future episodes? Do you have one in mind? Do you have a question about anything covered today, or have a different topic you think might be a good fit for an episode of the Chicago History Podcast? If so, send me an email at chicagohistorypod@gmail.com. I will be posting clips of news articles, pictures, and ads from back in the day related to this episode on the Chicago History Podcast social media pages. Check it out and give us a like, please. Thanks as always to John K. Schneider for creating the Chicago History Podcast logo and much of the art used on the social media pages. If you need creative work done, Johnny's your guy. Send him an email at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. If you would, please take a moment and like, subscribe, and kindly review this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and tell a friend. No, tell 3 friends. It helps us get the word out and reach new history fans and fans of Chicago. Get out and explore when possible. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe.